Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss just how much evidence we have about Reform UK being a credible challenge at the next general election, which would require them taking quite a lot of both Labour and Conservative seats. Lots of people, for example, make a lot of Reform UK finishing second to Labour in dozens of seats, but does that make them a threat? But first, for daily political commentary, please click the subscribe button so you don't miss out. So Reform UK wants to give the impression that they are going to challenge at the next general election. Elon Musk has claimed that they're going to win the next general election. Although I wouldn't set too much store on what he says, it's not entirely clear that he even knows what an election is. But I would say, first of all, to not pay too much attention to who came second in various constituencies this year. This is not as important a factor as how many votes they were behind. For example, in Liverpool-Walton, Reform UK came second to Labour, but were over 20,000 votes behind. In Sittingbourne and Sheppey, Reform UK came third in a seat Labour won, but only by about 1,400 votes. Now, which one do they stand the best chance of taking from Labour at the next election? The one where there were 1,400 votes behind, but in third place, or 20-odd thousand votes behind? So the position they finished in 2024 doesn't mean much compared with the margin between themselves and the Labour or the Conservatives, whichever one won. That doesn't mean where they finished in the league table of various constituencies doesn't matter at all. If people are thinking of voting tactically against the incumbent, they will naturally gravitate towards the second placed party as the obvious choice. So sure, in a seat where the Conservatives and Reform UK both finished behind Labour, those who want to vote tactically against Labour may well choose whichever of the two right-wing parties came second. But by and large, what matters most is how many votes you need to make up, what sort of majority you have to overcome. So what would be a realistic target against both Labour and the Conservatives? Well, before I discuss the difference in approach to both, let's sort of go down the results. I've worked out how many seats Reform UK finished 2,000, 5,000 and 10,000 votes behind both Labour and the Conservatives. And even though there were Tory MPs who weren't safe even on a 25,000 majority, that is because the Conservatives had been so bad for so long that they were ripe for a wipeout. Labour are not going to cause the damage the Tories did. In fact, on the balance of probability, things will be noticeably better. Now, whether those improvements are good enough is a matter for voters to decide for themselves. But Labour MPs sat on majorities of over £10,000 should, realistically be quite safe, barring what would now be very unforeseeable events. So what do we get? Well, there are 3 seats where Reform UK finished within 2,000 votes for Labour and 2 for the Tories. That would suggest about 5 targets that they could really go hard at straight away. Within 5,000 votes, you're talking up to 20 seats against Labour and 10 seats against the Tories. Now, realistically, these will be their actual targets. But if they fancied overturning mighty majorities of up to 10,000, then it becomes 165 seats against Labour and 74 against the Tories. So let's be ultra generous towards Farage here and say that he would be capable of overturning all of those majorities. And assuming there's no change to any seats currently held by any other party or independents, what would that do? Well, it would put Labour on 247 seats, the Tories on 47 seats, and Reform UK on 244 seats. That'd be quite a messy parliament, but not one in which Reform could form a government, even if they worked with the DUP and the Conservatives, who are the only people who would work with them. They still can't form a government. Labour and the Lib Dems would be just short of a majority. However, being realistic, if Reform UK were this successful at harvesting both Labour and Conservative votes, then it would certainly allow the Lib Dems to win more seats. So yeah, realistically, a coalition of Labour and the Lib Dems would be able to hold a majority. Not a great one, but it would be a majority. And that would be the government which emerged. And that relies on Reform UK being able to overturn majorities of up to 10,000 votes in both Labour and the Conservative constituencies equally well. But that is not realistic. But, that is the best they can possibly hope to achieve. And it would make Nigel Farage the leader of the opposition, not the Prime Minister. And to even achieve this, the swing towards Farage and his party would have to be fairly sizable. In terms of what margin is worth Reform targeting, I mean, it's down to a few factors. Like, first, obviously, if Labour make good on some of their improvements they're promising, it will be a lot harder to overcome a strong Labour lead. It could be a lot harder to overcome any Labour lead. Whereas the Tories are stuck with their record in government, that's not changing over the next few years. There's nothing they can do about it now. So it could be argued that it will be easier for Farage to overcome a 5,000 vote margin with a Conservative seat than a Labour one. So although there are more Labour seats under threat from Reform UK in theory than Conservative seats, that is largely a consequence of the fact Labour won a lot of seats by targetable margins and the Conservatives were left with very few seats to defend in the first place. However, the type of voters in an area is also important. Reform UK pushed the anti-immigration line pretty strongly. This will work better in some areas than others. Like, there are lots of Conservative voters who have no time for Nigel Farage or Reform UK. So for like true blue areas like that, where the Conservatives, may have struggled to hold on this year, they may not be realistic targets next time. And although there's a realistic chance that Reform UK could take some Labour seats at the next election, assuming the government actually delivers on the areas which Keir Starmer's been going over today, it's not likely to be many. Like, one thing Starmer made clear in his speech today is that one target is to get all regions seeing an increase in living standards. That's encouraging because it's all too easy to be able to show an average in increase in living standards across the country, but you still have some black spots where things stagnate or get even worse. And, those are the areas that will turn to Reform UK. And although Starmer keeps saying country before party, and nonetheless, he'll need to be smart and keep the closest eye on how his targets are doing in areas vulnerable to Reform UK. In fact, although the Conservatives remain the default threat to Labour in government, I'd be looking at Reform UK as the real threat. After all, if Nigel Farage builds momentum in the way he's aiming to do, if he's successful, then he is still likely to attract more Conservative votes than Labour. Now, it could be tighter at the next election because he's already harvested a lot of Conservative votes. But still, and in this scenario, any seats where Labour narrowly won against the Conservatives, ironically could be a bit more secure just because Reform UK will effectively keep that Conservative vote down. Unless, of course, the Tory leader at the time, who we don't know who it's going to be, sorry Kemi, we don't know it's you, unless the Tory leader at the time of the next election does a deal with Farage to stand down candidates in one another's agreed target seats. In fact, a pact between the Conservatives and Reform UK could, in theory, be a problem for Labour. Unless, of course, a pact like that costs the Conservatives and Reform too many of their own core support who do not like one another and would not welcome a pact. It's also worth considering the impact that Labour's policy to give 16 and 17-year-olds the vote as well. Unlike the Tories, Reform UK are attracting a decent number of younger voters, especially young men. However, the latest polling from More in Common shows that the proportion of young men supporting Reform UK is still lower than the average across all age groups averaged out. So although the introduction to the electorate of 16 and 17-year-olds may help Reform UK against the Tories, it doesn't do so against Labour. Finally, worth just pointing out the obvious caveat to all this. This is all based on polling and election results from this year. So public attitudes right now. Those attitudes are likely to change over the next few years as we build up to the next election. But will it be in Labour's favour or Reform UK's? And by how much? That we can only guess at right now, although some guesses are more likely than others. I don't know how well Labour will achieve its goals. I don't know how many voters will be satisfied and how many decide it's time to take a punt on the crazy option. But as Labour are probably going to make some important high salience things better, it would seem unlikely that Reform UK could eat a lot into Labour's lead anywhere. And they may not do so at all. But the Conservatives will be easier prey for them. Not only are the Tories making themselves seem like a weak sauce version of Reform UK, chasing after the same votes, but the Conservatives can do nothing about their record now. The best they can do is at least apologise for what the public blame them for, to at least give the impression that they mean to do something different next time, but they show no signs of wanting to do that right now. Which makes them much easier pickings for Reform UK than Labour. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, you can join for memberships. Thanks for watching. And until next time, I'll see you later.